You have seen this photograph before. A Soviet soldier on a rooftop, a red flag snapping in the wind. Behind him, the ruined skyline of Berlin, buildings reduced to skeletal silhouettes, smoke still rising from fires that have burned for days. Beneath him, somewhere in the rubble, the Third Reich is dying. It is May 1945. The war in Europe is over. This image has appeared on postage stamps, in history textbooks, on the walls of state buildings, in every documentary ever made about the end of the Second World War. It is, arguably, the single most recognized photograph of the entire conflict. There is one problem. Almost none of it is true. The flag was not raised by the soldiers, the Soviet Union said raised it. The photograph was not taken during the battle the Soviet Union said it was taken during. The man who actually planted the first Soviet flag on that roof, in the dark, under fire, while the building was still held by German troops, was a 23-year-old private who was denied the medal his commanders requested for him, and whose name the world never learned. And the photographer who took this image flew to Berlin specifically to recreate a picture he had seen from the other side of the world, bringing a flag his uncle had sewn from borrowed tablecloths. This is the story of what really happened. To understand what happened at the Reichstag in May 1945, you have to go back 3 months, to a palace on the Black Sea coast in February, where the 3 most powerful men in the world were deciding what would happen after the war ended. At Yalta, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin carved up post-war Europe into occupation zones. The dividing line between East and West would run roughly along the Elbe River. Berlin sat deep in what would become the Soviet zone. This meant something that changed the military calculation entirely. The Western Allies had no reason to race for Berlin. General Eisenhower told Stalin directly that American forces would halt at the Elbe. Taking Berlin would cost an estimated 100,000 American casualties for a city they would have to hand over to the Soviets once the fighting stopped. The race to Berlin, as it is usually portrayed in Western popular history, was a myth. But Stalin was in a race, just not the race most people imagine. Stalin wanted Berlin by May 1st, not for strategic reasons, not to end the war faster. He wanted it for a parade. May 1st, International Workers' Day, was the most important date in the Soviet political calendar. Every year, Stalin stood atop the Lenin Mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square and reviewed a military parade. In 1945, he wanted to be able to announce the fall of Berlin from that platform, in front of the cameras, on that exact day. The deadline was not a military objective, it was a propaganda schedule. And to meet it, he set 2 of his best generals against each other. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the First Belarusian Front, positioned directly east of Berlin, with the straightest road to the capital. He was the Soviet Union's most decorated general, the hero of Stalingrad, the man who had turned the tide at Kursk. In any rational world, he would have been given the job and left to do it. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front, positioned to the south, equally formidable, equally ambitious. Stalin could have appointed a single unified command. He did not. Instead, he deliberately blurred the boundary lines between the 2 fronts, telling both generals, in so many words, that Berlin was there for the taking. Then, on April 17th, he blurred those lines further, deepening the competition. A master practitioner of divide and rule, Stalin was engineering a race inside his own command. The result, historians would later observe, was that both marshals drove their forces toward Berlin with scant regard for casualties. That phrase contains tens of thousands of human lives. Before any Soviet soldier set foot in Berlin, they had to get through Seelow. The Seelow Heights sat 70 kilometers east of Berlin, a bluff rising above the Oder River floodplain, commanding the entire western approach to the capital. The Germans called it the Gates of Berlin. 110,000 German soldiers of the Ninth Army had dug in there, behind multiple defensive lines, with artillery zeroed on every open approach. Zhukov hit the position on April 16th in the pre-dawn darkness. He had a plan. He had transported 143 searchlights from Moscow's air defense ring, the largest anti-aircraft lights ever built, and positioned them along the attack front. The idea was to turn night into day. The lights would blind the German defenders. The lights would show Soviet infantry the path forward. The lights would give the attack an almost supernatural power. What happened instead would haunt Zhukov for the rest of his life. The artillery bombardment preceding the attack had been massive, the kind of thing that reshapes the land itself. Thousands of guns, hundreds of thousands of shells. The ground had become a churning cloud of smoke, pulverized earth, and burning debris. When Zhukov's searchlights came on, they hit that cloud. The light reflected back. It did not shine forward. It blazed backward, into the faces of the attacking Soviet infantry. It silhouetted them perfectly against the darkness. It turned them into targets. The German defenders, looking east from the heights, could see everything. The Soviet soldiers, moving west into the glare, could see nothing. The first assaults broke against the heights with devastating losses. Over the next 4 days, Zhukov threw wave after wave of men and armor at the position. The German defense held, then bent, then finally broke. By April 19th, the heights were Soviet. But the price had been catastrophic. By the most conservative estimates, 20,000 Soviet soldiers dead. By some accounts, 30,000 or more. Over 700 armored vehicles destroyed. And the battle for Berlin hadn't even begun. On April 21st, Soviet forces crossed into the city limits of Berlin for the first time. By April 23rd, the encirclement was complete. Something like 2.5 million Soviet soldiers surrounded a city of perhaps 3 million civilians, a depleted German garrison, and a leader who had retreated into a concrete bunker 50 feet below ground and was issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. The fighting in Berlin was unlike anything the war had produced. Street by street, block by block, building by building, room by room in some cases, Soviet soldiers and German defenders fought through a city already reduced to rubble by years of Allied bombing. Casualties in urban combat like this were grotesque and almost random. In total, the Battle of Berlin would cost the Soviet Union approximately 80,000 soldiers killed and 250,000 more wounded. Inside the ring of fire, Soviet command was fixated on a particular target, not Hitler's bunker, which sat beneath the Reich Chancellery several blocks to the southwest, where Stalin's real enemy was spending his last hours underground, not the Chancellery itself, not the Gestapo headquarters or the SS command complex, the Reichstag. It was a strange choice. The Reichstag had not housed the German parliament since 1933, when an arsonist set it ablaze on a February night, and Adolf Hitler used the fire as a pretext to declare a national emergency and seize dictatorial powers. Since then, the parliament had been dissolved as a meaningful institution. The Kroll Opera House across the plaza became the chamber where rubber stamp sessions were held. The Reichstag itself, its dome long since collapsed, was used as a hospital, a factory floor for the AEG Corporation making radio tubes, and by 1945 it housed a maternity ward run by the Charité, Berlin's great teaching hospital. At least several children were born there while the battle raged outside, but the Reichstag looked like what a capital was supposed to look like. It had columns, it had grandeur, it photographed well. 9 specially numbered victory banners were distributed to Soviet assault units. The first to raise a banner on the Reichstag would receive official recognition. To reach the Reichstag, Soviet infantry had to cross the Königsplatz, the wide-open plaza in front of the building. There was no cover. German machine guns and artillery from the building and surrounding positions swept the ground. The first Soviet assault across the plaza was cut down. The men who ran it died in the open, in daylight, under withering fire. A second assault, under covering fire from Soviet artillery and tanks, reached the building's entrance. Fighting then continued inside, floor by floor, staircase by staircase. German SS soldiers and Volkssturm militia contested every corridor. The basement was held into the night. If the staged Kaldai Reichstag photograph, Mikhail Minin's erased first flag, the Zhukov-Konev rivalry, the Battle of Berlin 1945, and how a tablecloth flag became the defining image of victory fascinate you, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We drop a new story every single week. Now, back to the flag that never was, the truth behind the most famous photo of World War II. At 10:40 in the evening on April 30th, 1945, Private Mikhail Minin climbed to the roof of the Reichstag. He was 23 years old. He was from a village in northwestern Russia. He had survived the entire war to reach this roof, in this city, on this night. German troops still held sections of the building below him. The city outside was still burning. The sound of fighting had not stopped. Minin and 3 comrades, Grigory Zagatov, Alexander Lysimenko, and Alexei Bobrov, had fought their way upward through the chaos. On the western pediment, Minin found an equestrian statue, one of the ornamental sculptures that decorated the Reichstag's roof. He climbed the statue. He fastened an improvised flagpole to its crown. A red flag went up over the Reichstag. The war's most symbolic moment had just happened, and no one photographed it. It was night. There was no photographer on the roof. There were only 4 soldiers in the dark, and the flag, and the burning city below them. German snipers shot the flag down the next morning. The Soviet state needed heroes to credit. It designated 2, Mikhail Yegorov, a Russian, and Melitin Kantaria, a Georgian. Both were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration the state could confer. The pairing was deliberate. 1 Russian, 1 Georgian, the same combination as Stalin himself. It was a piece of ethnic theater, designed to honor the leader while projecting a narrative of brotherhood among Soviet peoples. Minin and his 3 comrades received the Order of the Red Banner, a significant decoration, but not the one their commanders had requested for them. The request for the Hero of the Soviet Union was denied. The state had spoken. The story was decided. Yegorov and Kantaria had raised the flag. Meanwhile, a photographer was boarding a plane in Moscow. Yevgeny Khalday had been covering the war for TASS since the first day, all 4 years of it. He had photographed the liberation of city after city. He had watched his country burn and then begin to fight back. His father and 3 of his 4 sisters had been murdered by the Nazis in Ukraine. He had also seen a photograph from the Pacific. Joe Rosenthal's picture of American Marines raising a flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima, taken in February 1945, had gone around the world. It was already the defining image of the American war effort. Khalday, like every photographer in the world, had seen it, and he understood what it meant to have an image like that. Before leaving Moscow, he went to a shop and persuaded a reluctant shopkeeper to lend him 3 red tablecloths. He brought them to his uncle, a Jewish tailor, who sewed a hammer, sickle, and yellow star onto the cloth to create a flag. Khalday packed it in his bag and flew to Berlin. He was going to take the Soviet Iwo Jima. On May 2nd, 1945, 2 days after Minin had raised the first flag in the dark, Berlin surrendered. The fighting was over. Khalday arrived at the Reichstag. He looked for soldiers to put in his photograph. He did not find the men who had actually stormed the building. He found 3 soldiers from the 8th Guards Army who happened to be nearby. None of them had taken part in the Reichstag assault. He brought them to the roof with his tablecloth flag and composed his shot. He was thinking of Rosenthal's photograph. He arranged his soldiers the same way. 1 man holding the flag aloft, leaning into an implied wind, the others below him. The ruined city behind them, the drama of victory made visible. He took the picture. Then he went back to Moscow to develop it. When Khalday developed his photographs in Moscow, a censor noticed something in the image. One of the 3 soldiers in the picture was wearing 2 wristwatches, 1 on each wrist. In the lawless final days of the war, Soviet soldiers had looted freely from German civilians. 2 watches on 1 wrist was a visible, embarrassing record of that. It would not do. The watch was removed from the print. Smoke was added to the background, more dramatic than what was actually there. The red of the banner was intensified. Clouds were painted in to give the sky more weight. In at least one version, a tank was cut and pasted in from another photograph. Combat aircraft were painted onto the sky. The image was published in Pravda. It was reproduced across the Soviet Union and across the world. It appeared on stamps, on war memorials, on the walls of schoolrooms. The original, unretouched negative sat in an archive, largely unseen, for nearly 70 years. It was rediscovered in 2013. It is now held in the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. If you look at the unretouched version, you can still see the second watch. On May 7, 1945, in Reims, France, in the headquarters of Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower, German Chief of Staff Alfred Jodl signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over, except Stalin said it wasn't. He refused to recognize the Reims signing. He demanded a second surrender ceremony on Soviet soil, with Soviet representatives presiding. The ceremony was arranged in Berlin-Karlshorst, where Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second surrender document before Soviet Marshal Zhukov. The signing was completed on the night of May 8th, but in Moscow, it was already past midnight. It was May 9th. This is why Russia celebrates Victory Day on May 9th, while the rest of the world marks VE Day on May 8th. It is not a calendar quirk. It is the direct result of Stalin's insistence that the Soviet Union alone would define the terms of its victory, even down to the date. Mikhail Minin went home. He left the army. He became a teacher. He lived in the town of Pskov in northwestern Russia and taught school for decades. His achievement, being the first Soviet soldier to plant a flag on the Reichstag roof, was known to historians, acknowledged in some Soviet records, but officially overshadowed by the Yegorov-Kantaria story and the Khalday photograph. In 1996, after the Soviet Union had been gone for 5 years, the Russian government gave him a state award. He was in his 70s by then. In his later years, he gave interviews, and the record of what actually happened on the night of April 30th began to be told more fully. He died in 2008. Yevgeny Khalday's fate was more complicated. In 1948, he was fired from TASS. Stalin's late years brought a wave of anti-Semitic purges, and Khalday, a Jewish photographer with a prominent profile, was not protected by his most famous image. He spent years as a freelancer, unable to publish with the full freedom his talent warranted. The state that had promoted his photograph had no use for him personally. He was rehabilitated in the post-Soviet period. International exhibitions of his work toured the world. He received recognition from the International Center of Photography in New York. He lived to see himself acknowledged as one of the great photographers of the 20th century. He died in Moscow in 1997. The photograph he staged on a Berlin rooftop in May 1945 remains, by any measure, one of the most powerful images ever made. Whether it is a lie or a truth, or something more complicated than either, is a question he left unanswered. It is worth noting, before we go, that the most famous American photograph of the Second World War was also not quite what it appeared to be. Joe Rosenthal's Iwo Jima image captured the second flag raised on Mount Suribachi that day. A smaller flag had been raised first, earlier in the morning, by a different group of Marines. Command wanted a bigger flag, more visible from the ships offshore. A second flag was found and brought up. It was the raising of that second flag, by men who had not been in the first group, that Rosenthal photographed. The soldiers in Rosenthal's photograph were genuine Marines who had fought on Iwo Jima. The moment was real, but it was a replacement moment, not the first one. Both the most famous American photograph and the most famous Soviet photograph of World War II show a second flag, not the first. Both are images of men who were not the original flag raisers. Both became the defining images of their nation's wars. This is not a coincidence. It is something about what propaganda photographs require. Not the truth of what happened, but the image of what we wish had been recorded. 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the Battle of Berlin. 30,000 died in 4 days on the Seelow Heights, before the battle for the city even began. They did not die for a photograph. They died for many reasons. For the Soviet Union, for their families, for revenge against an army that had killed 27 million of their countrymen, for simple survival, for the chance to go home. The photograph of the flag over the Reichstag came after all of that. It was made in an hour on a clear morning by a man with a borrowed flag and a clear artistic vision, and 3 soldiers who had nothing to do with the assault on the building behind them. And yet, the photograph is not nothing. The moment it represents the end of Nazi Germany, the raising of a red flag over the symbolic capital of the regime that had tried to erase the Soviet people. That moment was real. The victory was real. The cost was real. What was not real was the story told about how it happened. The man who actually raised the first flag spent the rest of his life teaching school in a small Russian city. The photograph is still on the wall,